This is Julie, and before we get started, I want to let you know about a special end-of-the-year campaign as part of the Women Podcasters in Solidarity initiative to raise money for the mothers, caretakers, and activists on the front lines of gun violence prevention. To make sure you get notified about the campaign, press pause now and go sign up for email updates at mothersquest.com and follow the Mothers Quest page on Facebook. You can also reach out to me if you'd like to be one of the first to seed the fund with your contribution. Now onto the show. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neale, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to two high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? In the months leading up to a big milestone birthday, I decided it was time to stop sidelining my dreams and realize that I'm the hero of my own journey. I knew I didn't want to do it alone, so I created this podcast to learn from other moms on their own quest, so their words of wisdom and lessons learned could help light the way for mine. I created this podcast for myself. Come along with me, and you'll find some treasures of your own. Hello, and welcome to this special episode of the Mother's Quest podcast, the second in a series I'm recording for the Women Podcasters in Solidarity initiative on the subject of gun safety and the intersectional impact of gun violence on our communities. As the mother of two boys, I was interested in having a conversation with an expert on this subject who's also a man and a father, and I'm so grateful to have found one willing to go deep and be vulnerable in gun prevention advocate Lad Everitt. Lad has been involved in this movement since 1993, when his life changed forever after a man boarded a rush hour train on the Long Island Railroad and opened fire with a handgun, killing 6 and wounding 19. This train was the one Lad took regularly, and he realized that it easily could have been him killed that day. That moment sparked Lad to attend the Million Mom March in 2000 in Washington, D.C., where despite the fact that he was a single man with no children, he found himself stepping into leadership for a local chapter and working alongside mothers for gun safety. More than 2 decades later, he has become a father himself and is still deeply committed to this work. After 10 years as a strategic communications and social media specialist with the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, Lad took the position he holds today as director of One Pulse for America, a gun violence prevention group established after the Florida Pulse nightclub shooting by acclaimed actor, LGBTQ rights activist George Takei. Before I share more about what we explore in this episode, I want to introduce you to a powerful advocate for trauma-informed law, my friend Helgi Mackey, with this episode's dedication.
Hi, my name is Helgi Mackey. I'm a lawyer and the founder of TraumaInformedLaw.org, an initiative to help justice professionals and communities reduce the impact of trauma and violence on public health. I'm honored to dedicate this episode to all mothers affected by cycles of gun violence who witness and deal with its aftermath for generations, especially the mothers affected by the terrorist attack in Pittsburgh and the anti-Semitic hate crime shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue on Saturday, October 27, 2018. They deserve our heartfelt, meaningful support in the wake of life-altering gun violence. I created the Trauma-Informed Law Initiative after my own experiences with witnessing violence. Personally, I've seen that even the threat of gun violence can drastically change a life forever. My mother faced interpersonal violence of all kinds, including the direct threat of gun violence. I speak about trauma to honor my mother and her death by suicide at the age of 58. Professionally, I too often hear unacknowledged stories about lives irrevocably changed by gun violence and gun control advocacy. Even seeing pictures of gun violence can be profoundly traumatizing. Vicarious trauma affects many professionals and family members involved in the justice system, impacting their health for years afterwards and sometimes even leading to suicide. This episode is really about creating collective courage. I invite you to consider supporting the most courageous approaches to gun control possible because our communities can no longer afford gun violence. Its impact on our humanity is simply too high.
Thank you, Helgi, for sharing about your own personal journey, for this thoughtful dedication to the mothers who've lost loved ones of their own to gun violence, and for shining a light on the impact of trauma. The honesty and clarity that you bring to the conversation was also evident as we traced Lad's epic life journey, from growing up as a young boy influenced by Marvel Comics to stepping into his own powers as a caring father and a decades-long gun control advocate. I appreciated Lad's humility as he expressed how the trauma of doing this work has impacted him, his own growing pains as he's learning about and confronting racism and patriarchy, and the importance of giving the microphone and following the lead of young people, who he says are the emotional and cultural leaders of the movement today. Lad leaves us with hopefulness about the possibility for real change after the midterm elections, along with the challenge to hold our elected officials accountable, beginning with a specific request of Nancy Pelosi to focus on new and bold, not watered down gun policy changes. I was inspired by the example in Lad of a male leader connected to his emotions, doing meaningful work and looking for ways to share his privilege and influence with voices that should have more representation in the movement. Lad and I both left the conversation feeling enriched by the opportunity to talk through complex issues, and I'm excited to invite you in to listen with us and then move into action for gun safety alongside us. I'm Julie Neale, and this is Mother's Quest. Lad, welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast for one of a series of conversations I'm doing for this season's Women Podcasters in Solidarity initiative. We have selected the topic of gun safety and the impact of gun violence on our communities with an intersectional lens. And several people have recommended you, including Gloria Pan from Moms Rising, who is the first person I interviewed on this topic. So I'm really grateful for your time and your years of service to this issue, and just really looking forward to learning from you today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be talking to you.
The question I begin with every guest is a chance to learn a little bit about who you are. Tell me about your own childhood and the impact that your mother had in shaping who you are today.
Oh, wow. I remember being a very happy kid. I was born in Florida, in Miami, and spent my first 3 years there. But then we moved to New York, and that's where I really grew up. I was a happy kid. I was very much a mother's boy. I loved my mom a lot when I was young, very attached to her. My parents divorced when I was 9. That was probably the really first tough thing I went through. And my relationship after that changed a little bit with my mom. I did go through that teenage phase where I was very angry at her and working through issues with her. I don't mean to be creepy by this, but my mom, I think in many ways, was my first love. I mean, I just remember adoring her when I was young. You know, she was my whole world. I think the fact that I'm concerned about women's issues and that I want to live in a society where men and women have equal power is probably because I fundamentally respected, I guess, or loved both my parents.
The next thing I want to hear more about is what you've been on a quest for in your life. And part of why I started Mother's Quest was I wanted to step into this idea that I could live what I call an epic life, where everything that mattered most to me is something I could create and really go after and not allow fear or challenges get in my way, and really believe like I'm the author of my story. How does that idea land for you about being on a quest, and how has working towards gun safety and gun control become part of yours?
I can definitely relate to what you're saying. I mean, I very much view gun control work as my calling, and I think I very much have a superhero mentality about it. You know, I grew up reading comics. You know, Stan Lee just passed away. That was a huge thing for me. He probably had more influence as a man on me than anyone but my father in terms of moral development. So I really grew up, I think, believing that you had a duty to try to help people, that that's what heroes did, to the point of sacrifice. So I very much feel the same way. I see what's happening in this country. It terrifies me, and I want to be part of something effective that turns the dial the other way back towards democracy. And I do believe in the power to, actualize your dreams. Not that it always works out. I think if you want something bad enough, you can get into a field and make a difference. So I think I very much see it in those terms.
I want to ask you more about how, the issue of guns came to the forefront, as you're calling. But before we do that, I have been struck too this week by the death of Stan Lee. I mentioned to you that my older son, who's 14, is a huge Marvel fan. And, once he's an aspiring writer himself and very much influenced, I think, by the storytelling arc of a superhero. At the same time, he and I were watching last night a movie I had mentioned to you called The Mask We Live In, which really looks at how masculinity is part of the social fabric for boys as they grow up, but to an extreme where it becomes almost toxic, and the messages and the images that boys grow up with and the impact of that. And I saw on a Facebook post of yours that you had a picture of you and Stan Lee, and you mentioned, that you had that he's come a long way, Stan Lee, he had in his own,
yes,
the way that he saw things and what he portrayed.
Yes.
I just want to hear a little bit about what you think about that, about the potential negative impact on boys and men about, being a superhero, which is often connected to violence, and where you saw Stan Lee begin to move in his own thinking.
Well, on the subject of Stan Lee, I think Stan Lee is a cautionary tale about not allowing someone room for growth, right? It would have been very easy for people in the mid-'60s or, even the late '60s to have legitimate claims about racist portrayals in Marvel Comics, portrayals, certainly patriarchy. I mean, Stan didn't take Invisible Woman seriously in the beginning, or Scarlet Witch or the other female characters. It would have been easy at that point to rule him out and say, oh, you're a racist, you're a male chauvinist, or worse, you should have no voice here. But the fascinating thing about Stan Lee is even while those are the views that he held as a young and even middle-aged man, probably, I think at that point, he inspired kids like me at that time to completely reject racism and eventually to value women too. Although I can see what you're saying about that. I think in the early days when there weren't strong role models for women in the comics, I agree. When you're only seeing men being strong, when there is some level of physical violence in the comics, although when I was a kid, it was much less than what you see today. I think there's a lot more blood today in the comics. I acknowledge that. But I do think the fact that women are now portrayed as very strong superheroes, which is kind of consummate with the Captain Marvel movie coming out next year, I think that's a good thing. I think my daughters now love comics. I read Marvel comics with them every night, and they want to read all the stories where the women do cool things. They don't want to read anything about a man superhero.
I'm fascinated by all this history, and I know my son's going to want to listen to this too. As you're talking, I'm appreciating so much. You and I made intentions for this conversation, and I mentioned the conversation I had with Nicole Lee for the last initiative about stepping into conversation with a growth mindset. And it sounds like, Stan Lee welcomed the ability to grow and change, and his work and the influence of his work really went with that. And in particular, I'm thinking about what we experienced last year with the movie Black Panther.
Yeah.
Just what a revolution that really was.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing that a man who once depicted women as somewhat, certainly inferior to men in terms of authority and power? I mean, there were very crude portrayals of Asian Americans in Marvel Comics in regards to the Vietnam War. There were certainly at times racist portrayals of people of color. There's no doubt about it. But this is a man who nonetheless created a character who has brought pride to people of color around the world. That is remarkable. And I don't know, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure I see that level of patience with folks in the gun violence prevention movement, with taking that amount of time to get it right. But, we're all in a new boat right now. We're in an America that's changing both negatively very quickly and positively very quickly. And I think we're all trying to grow.
Yeah. Well, let's use this as a way to refocus on the issue of guns in our society and the work you do.
How did it become part of your epic quest?
Well, first, I grew up in a very safe neighborhood, primarily in Long Island, New York, and I never remember any incidents about certainly someone having a gun in schools that I went to. I can't even remember a knife being found in schools I went to. It was very safe. I don't remember any gun homicides. I'm sure there were gun suicides occurring, but they weren't publicized, so I didn't know about them. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I really didn't care. I went to college and I just didn't care about the issue at all. I had never thought about it. It had never affected me. But, it changed in college because there was a really grisly mass shooting on the Long Island Railroad where a guy brought a couple of semi-automatic handguns on a rush hour train and just started to kill people. And that really shook me up because after my parents divorced, I would take that train often into the city to see my dad and then back home to my mom. And I'd be, like 11, 12 years old riding these trains alone. And probably everyone on Long Island at that point thought, if not for the grace of God, that was me on that train. I think at that point, I just looked at the stats, like how many people are dying from gun violence every year in the U.S. And at that point, it was over 40,000 a year. And I was a little bit of a military history buff, and I was familiar with casualty totals. And I'm thinking 40,000 a year. I'm like, that's like on par with the Korean War. I'm like, that is just utterly insane. Mm-hmm. And it became one of those issues where the more you learn, the more outraged you become because you progressively find out how weak our gun laws really are. I mean, they're gossamer, and you eventually dig so deep in that, you just can't believe we've allowed this to continue. And it became my calling. I don't know if I've ever seriously considered why I react to this issue so viscerally. I think maybe there's an element, getting back to the comics theme, there's a great line in the first Captain America movie where he says, something about, I don't like bullies. And I think I had a bit of that mentality. I think, maybe I saw how folks on the pro-gun side behaved and treated women, certainly, and others, and everyone else, survivors, everybody else. And maybe that outraged me. But there was also a democratic component about it. The hook for me was when I learned that they thought they had an individual right to inflict violence on our government when they personally believed our government was behaving tyrannically. And in terms of how I view civics in this society and the democratic structure of our government, I mean, that also really outraged. I just couldn't believe that was an accepted view, even at the highest levels in Congress. Those are some of the things that resonated with me. But the sealer for me was when I went to the Million Mom March at the Capitol on Mother's Day in 2000 after Columbine. Approximately 750,000 people there that day. I just went by myself. It was an amazing day, incredibly diverse families, all different kinds of people from all over the country. Just a gorgeous day. And I started volunteering after that. And whatever originally motivated me with this never fell away. I still feel as passionate about it now as I did on the very first day.
I talk a lot about spark moments, these moments where something becomes really clear and it really does propel you into action. And I'm feeling really moved that for you, part of at least one of the spark moments was being among mothers at this Million Mom March.
Absolutely.
Even before you were a parent, right?
Oh, yeah. I was a single guy down there. I asked my parents to go, but they wouldn't come. So I had to go alone. And, you're right. This is true. There was something about the identity of mother, the nurturer, the one who was more compassionate. There was certainly something there. And then, quite frankly, I went on to volunteer and lead the DC chapter of the Million Mom March. I was mentored by a woman of color who led the chapter when I first got there. Then I led it for many years. It was really me and all women the entire time. I was like the one guy, and I was surrounded by white and women of color. And I loved working with them. I thought things were complicated back then. And now I look back and I just miss them. And I think we accomplished some good things. We didn't save the world, but we did honest work.
That was around 2000, you said?
2000 was when I started as a volunteer.
So, we're almost 20 years later, and you have, if anything, just deepened your commitment and your involvement with this issue as your calling. Can you just sort of trace for me your own quest and then alongside it, how things have changed in these almost 20 years?
It's very hard to work in this field. I'll just be honest. You have to be like Rocky in the first two Rocky movies. You have to be able to be punched in the face repeatedly and keep getting up. That's just the reality. primarily for two reasons. Number one, because as you know, there has been progress at the state level, but at the federal level, there's been nearly nothing. And the other reason, three reasons actually. The second reason, the vicarious trauma you deal with, watching videos of shootings every day.
Yeah.
I mean, I would go into the office when I worked at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. I'd read about at least 5 or 6 shootings every day there, at least, just to follow the daily news. And, and that gets to you after a while. It gets to you after a while. It soaks in your system. You think you're beating it for your first, 5 to 10 years, and then it catches up with you. And then the last thing, of course, is just the harassment from pro-gun activists. As a man, it wasn't half as bad as, for me as it would be for a woman. I mean, women are certainly targeted. Survivors are targeted. So it's hard. You have to have a huge wellspring of faith to stay doing this work. But it's also nice to be in a position now, even though we face such danger, where the hope of real progress really is something tangible. It's not just a dream anymore.
Well, I want to pursue that thread as we get into exploring what I call the epic guideposts. And, when I set out to live an epic life, it really did capture this metaphor of being on the hero or heroine's journey. But also epic for me is an acronym mnemonic for the guideposts that I think help us live that life when we're raising our children. And what I like to do for these episodes with the Women Podcasters in Solidarity Initiative is take that same epic framework and actually really dig into it from the perspective of this particular issue. So E stands for engaged, and it's about being engaged mindfully with our children. I'd love to hear, what do you feel, where is there some hope in terms of how we engage young people? And, certainly this year, the tragedy in Parkland also brought the hopefulness of some of the most inspiring, outspoken, committed advocates. What are your thoughts about how we can both educate our children, raise them to be advocates, protect them from gun violence? Share with me some of your thoughts.
There's a lot there. I mean, I don't know if I can answer all that. The young people are the leaders of this movement now. I mean, the national gun violence prevention structure is not high school students yet, but really the emotional and I think cultural leaders on this issue are young people. They're fearless in a way that the gun control movement never was, and also certainly congressional Democrats have been beat up for so many years by the gun lobby that they've conditioned us really to either limit our advocacy or just not talk at all or just be silent through intimidation, harassment, sometimes threats. So the beautiful thing I think about the post-Parkland movement was they just came to the issue with fresh eyes. All this baggage that Democrats carry on gun control, that the kids just didn't have any of that. They just saw it with fresh eyes, and what they saw was that allowing a kid like Nicholas Cruz to get an assault rifle is insane. It just makes no sense. Constitutionally, morally, however you want to cut it, it makes no sense. And I think that helped immensely. I think more than anything, it was their attitude, not the attitude of the gun control movement, that made that cultural shift on the issue. I really don't think the professionals had anything to do with that. I think it was the David Hoggs and kids across the country. I mean, they mobilized kids in cities like Chicago, in small towns, I mean, all over the country to start talking about this issue. And that certainly, made a huge change. What I fear with them is that they might begin listening to adults like me. That's what I fear. I've already heard rumors, for example, that March for Our Lives, while they still support an assault weapons ban, doesn't think it's worth really advocating for one in this new Congress. That kind of talk disturbs me because that's how we lost the NRA for 40 years, and I don't want to go back to that. The way you win is with confidence and by leading boldly. And I think now they're exhausted. They just did this bus trip across America. I think they're emotionally exhausted. But I hope when they have time to reflect, they'll understand that they didn't get us this far by leading meekly. They got us this far by asking by what should be done and not holding back.
I hope maybe that this conversation will reach them. What are the ways that as adults and as parents, we can support the youth leaders to help move this movement forward?
I'm not sure. One of the things is just by telling your kids you love them every day and giving them positive encouragement and being very mindful, I guess, of saying things to them that would limit their esteem or make them feel like you're looking down on them or disappointed in them. You know, when you have multiple kids, obviously there's multiple personalities involved. It gets a little bit trickier. I think you have to make kids feel like they can do wonderful things, even if they're doing very simple tasks. You know, if you see your kid likes drawing, even if your kid's art looks like, garbage to you, tell them that's terrific. You know, do you want some new supplies to work with? You know, things along those lines. I think I'm no expert here. I think we're in an age of parenting now where parents are more comfortable telling their kids they love them and certainly more mindful than my parents were of what we say in front of them. And I think that's good. I think particularly the female leaders of the next generation will certainly feel more empowered. I hope, but I believe that will be the case. And with boys, it's a little bit of a different thing. With boys, they're negotiating a lot of changes in these cultural and social norms. And maybe it's a little bit different with the way you need to raise a boy than a girl. But you have boys, I do not. So that's a little bit more hypothetical for me.
What I'm appreciating, though, is your perspective as a white male who has chosen to work on this issue where you're confronting patriarchy and honestly white supremacism often. What would be your biggest piece of advice for me as a mother raising a white son who has a lot of privilege for him to be an advocate in the best ways for women, for people of color, for this issue about gun safety?
That's a good question. You know, education certainly plays a role in that, right? You want him to know about people who are less fortunate or people who have struggled in the past to make him as comfortable as he is. Those are the types of lessons that we teach children, right? Somebody broke their back to get you this far. It's a more common theme, certainly when you're talking about, like, let's say the civil rights movement leading to greater rights for people of color. But it's, those stories exist too with white Americans, whether we're telling lore about George Washington or whoever it was. So I think a sense of context is important. A lot of kids might grow up now and think that the way they talk about race and gender is the way America has always talked about that. They need a sense of context. They need to know that a lot has changed in that area, and it's because of people's passion and commitment. You know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg comes immediately to mind. I think every young man should be taught about her, every young kid, period. So they begin seeing those types of role models as powerful and noteworthy and important in the history of the country. Beyond that, it's a little more touchy-feely. I mean, beyond that, it's more just about raising a kid who's compassionate and seeks justice. I don't know if there's a playbook on that, though.
Well, I appreciate what you were saying before about showing our boys, especially, that we love them and allowing them to have their full range of emotions.
Oh, yeah. Let them cry, too. Actually, that's probably the most important thing I can tell you. Teach boys that crying is just fine. That will save a lot of future violence just unto itself. Teach boys that crying is a very, very healthy way to deal with their emotions.
I mentioned that we were watching this movie last night, The Mask We Live In, and that was definitely one of the key things about how early on boys are told that it's not okay to cry. And so I had a conversation with my son about, how do you feel about this? And thankfully, so far, one of his strengths is his ability to connect to how he's really feeling, to be able to identify his emotions and talk about it, and to feel like there's space for that. So
that's awesome. He'll make a good partner to someone one day. Yeah, that's great.
I think so. And when I asked how could we support young people to be at the forefront of the movement, you went to how we can support our children to grow into healthy people and be good parents, which I really appreciate. But I also am curious specifically about, like, what can we do to support the young people that you're now saying have become the voice of the gun control movement? What specifically could we do to support them?
I think you have to have an interest in working with them. One of my volunteers at One Pulse right now is a young lady who is the co-founder of Montgomery County Students for Gun Control, who's done terrific work. And I ask her a lot of questions. I just like hearing her perspective. It's important to me to hear it. And just as one example, like recently I was approached by a pastor in the Baltimore area who wanted to put together an awards program for young gun violence prevention activists in Maryland. And that's something I really enjoyed doing, helping him get together a list, doing research and helping get together a list of young people that have done great work on this issue who are now going to be recognized in an upcoming dinner and award ceremony. I mean, I think you have to show an interest in working with them. You have to acknowledge the work they're doing. And like you would with anyone else who's doing work that helps the community, thank them. And you have to, for lack of a better term, be willing to be replaced by them.
So, giving them voice, engaging with them, and creating space for them to step into more leadership. I'm thinking this week, and I'll link to this in the show notes, about a Facebook friend of mine and a really incredible writer, Jenna Schwartz. Her daughter was in a lockdown situation where they thought there was a real threat. And so for hours, both her daughter and the mom thought she might not come home.
Ugh.
And her daughter wrote this really powerful essay, which was basically, like, adults, you need to hand us the microphone.
Yeah, for sure.
What it's like for us to live in fear of
it's horrible
each day.
Yeah. I was talking to a teacher, a very good friend of mine, a teacher in Maryland the other day. He came over very upset. He was talking about how they had just done some drill for Montgomery County teachers where they literally got to the point of walking through steps to deal with a mass, to the point of like physically confronting a mass shooter and trying to disable them. Mm. And he was outraged. I think he has the feeling that a lot of people have now, which is, why beat me here if you need to, but why the hell are adults spending so much time putting body armor on kids and putting up metal detectors rather than just getting their butts together on a weekday or a weekend day and going to lobby legislators for gun control laws so that these people can't get guns anymore? Like, why are we accommodating a degenerate culture? That's the frustration I have with it. I don't want to have to put a metal plate on my daughter's back because people are cowards and afraid to stand up to the NRA. That's nuts because they actually believe we have to live like this. We don't have to live like this. So it's an outrageous thing.
Let's move into the next guidepost then, P, which stands for passionate and purposeful. And this is about the impact that we can make beyond our families. With your unique perspective of all of these years working on this issue and the fact that you have still stayed in it, even after what you've described in terms of being a target and the trauma that you have been through just being so close to this issue. What is the pathway forward? You've already named, listening to and putting young people at the forefront. But what else specifically, maybe in the way of policy, where do we need to go to begin to see some real change?
Well, I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the program when we do the challenge, but I think the first thing is we just need to expect more from our leaders. Democrats have led very meekly on the gun control issue, if at all, for the past 4 decades. When they do ask for something, it's typically minuscule. An example of that would be after the Newtown shooting, the Mansion to Me Amendment, which was so loaded with language from the NRA and other pro-gun groups that we could have a reasonable debate as to whether it would do more harm than good. Now that we've cleared the midterm elections and gun control advocates, not people that were secretly pro-gun control, people that campaigned on it with pride on it, kicked the NRA's butt by state across the country. It's time to stop being dazzled by low expectation. We need to see what we accomplished in this election. And we need to demand more from our leaders in response. And they should want to be energizing and mobilizing their pro-gun control base right now. It just helped them win a huge election. So you can't mobilize and energize your base with half-baked legislation where it's garbage legislation, but you got 14 Republicans on it. I don't want to see that type of leadership moving forward. I want to see House Democrats or whoever it is moving forward, going for it. And rather than approaching it under the paradigm they have for 4 decades of weakness and hand-wringing and, oh no, we can't possibly say that publicly, I really want to see them lay out what type of society do you want America to be in the future vis-a-vis guns, and taking this very seriously, what policy will it take to disarm violent individuals in this country? If we really want to accomplish that goal, what will it take? And to stop these daily horrors. But I'm tired of all the half-baked stuff, and that's what I fear the most. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. The single thing I fear the most right now is professional gun control organizations influencing the David Hoggs out there, the Emily Gonzalez's, and convincing them to moderate and limit their advocacy under the theory that it'll harm them with the broader American public to see bold, confident leadership on gun control. That's kind of what keeps me awake at night. That's the only way we can lose, I think, long term. The other way we can lose is Kavanaugh, but that's a separate question.
In this space where we're talking about the way to impact change, I'd like to hear your perspective on every time there's a mass shooting. And it's really important to remember that these mass shootings are not the sum total of our gun violence problem. Police brutality is gun violence. What is happening in cities like Chicago is gun violence. But in the mass shootings, every time, a white male is found to be often who has had a history of violence, domestic violence, or mental illness, there is this desire to shift the focus of the change on the issue of mental health, for instance. What is your stance about that? Like, what do you have to say about that when that becomes the center of the dialogue for change?
I would say first that I think the gun violence prevention movement has done a terrific job of kind of fighting back against stigmatization of the mentally ill. One of the top organizations on that is the place where I used to work, Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, led by Josh Horowitz, that really presses that theme. There is a tremendous amount of consciousness within the movement about not stigmatizing people, and I'll just give you like an example in my everyday life is I used to use the term crazy routinely, just in my daily communication. I'm not going to say I never use it anymore. If I do consider using it, I always stop and think, do I need to use this word or can I possibly use something else? You know what I mean? Trying to get away from words that were previously used as harmless, but which inflicted damage on vulnerable people. So there really is a consciousness about that within the movement. But, the gun lobby, the NRA obviously has a reason to perpetuate that theme. Gets away from having to do anything to regulate the gun industry, which preserves their profits. If you want to get into the issue of the white men, why don't they want to talk about the young white men, or not always young, or just white men, period, perpetrating these shootings? It's probably because the same people that have kept our gun laws weak are the same guys who have modeled the behavior that these young men are picking up on. I mean, that might have been hyperbole in the past, but I mean, look who's in the White House. Like the bomber. If you're a person who's in crisis right now and picking up all these cues from popular culture, I mean, you can look to the White House now and see misogyny, racism, the promotion of violence, the open promotion of violence. There's no mystery anymore about where these signals are coming from. And they are coming from typically conservative, radicalized white men in this society who are in positions of power. That's a terrifying thing. That's something that as a society we're going to have to heal over the long term, but it's also something we have to combat in the short term by modeling different behavior for young men when we can. That's part of the reason that I did the protest that we had talked about with other men for women's rights. Largely I did it for women, but I also was hoping that other men, including young men, would look at that and say, rather than these guys are wusses, I was hoping that some would say, wow, these guys look pretty confident. Their chins are up, their chests are out, they're chanting. This doesn't look like weakness to me. It looks like strength. And they're willing to be arrested for it? Damn. That's the thought process I hope to engender.
You were telling me about this protest before we officially started recording. So can you summarize briefly what that was?
Yeah, it was during the protests on Capitol Hill during the Kavanaugh hearings. And I want to make it clear, primarily it was women who were engaged in direct nonviolent action at the Capitol in front of the Supreme Court and elsewhere. They were largely the people being arrested for nonviolent demonstrations. But I happened on a given day to link up with a group of men, including Michael Skolnick, Reverend Kirsten Foy from National Action Network, and others, who were preparing to do this men's protest on behalf of women, where it was almost as if we were doing penance for ages of abuse to women, not just in this country, but really in the world, and declaring a different intent moving forward to be conscious of the way we've harmed women and to begin to really treat them as equals. And we blocked the street in front of the Supreme Court and were arrested and were taken to a DC precinct full of women protesters who had been arrested, who cheered us as we came in. That was the protest.
What was the impact of that for you?
I'll say this. I have never done anything in my life that generated as emphatic thank yous as that protest. It was weird. I was getting a lot of thank yous from women in the same words where they were saying, thank you is not enough to express how much this meant to me. A lot of women were saying that. A lot of them were saying they were crying watching it. Women on the scene were crying as we were doing it. I've never seen anything like that from something I've done. So it was really remarkable. And I probably bothered Michael and company right after because the midterms were coming out. I emailed them. I'm like, we've got to do another one. It means so much to women. They were telling me, let's get past the midterms. And I was like, you're right. But, my immediate reaction when I got out after I was processed was, I'm doing this again. And that was my immediate reaction. I'm doing this again. And I hope I can inspire other men to do it because it was that meaningful to women. Women are living in this country right now where, like I said, the highest man in the country is demeaning them on a daily basis. And there's an existential fear probably now among people of color, among women, among anyone who's in a vulnerable population. And I think to see men, white and black men, standing together with this type of declaration, I think meant the world to them. They were probably like, where did this come from, right? In this country right now. So I guess the lesson there is, you have to see the hate being provided on one side, and if you can, reinforce it with love on the other.
I noticed as you were talking now, just feeling really emotional, imagining what it will be like. Your daughters are still young, but, as they grow up, to be impacted from the knowledge of the stand you took.
Well, I'm terrified for them. I'll be honest. Right now, there's such doubt about our democracy. I think what keeps me going more than anything right now is just being the father of two daughters. You can watch the Kavanaugh hearings as the father of two daughters, and you'll be in existential terror hearing about his background and the things he's defending. It's a scary time, but yeah, I think what you were suggesting is how important it is to get it right in the future. And I agree. My dream is for my daughters to have literally real equal rights with men in this society. I want everybody to have equal rights. My dream for America is one person, one vote. And your vote does not mean any less than anyone else's. Money is out of the process. It's just one person, one vote. And no one is held below the other. And, part of that obviously would be racial equality and also certainly gender equality.
Before we move into the next guidepost, which stands for invested in ourselves, and I have a lot of questions for you there. I'm struck in this moment by this idea of one vote and also how much taking away the right to vote. And I'm thinking particularly of so many men of color who have been incarcerated, how that continues to perpetuate lack of gun control legislation. Particularly in Florida, I know there was a big win. Do you have anything you want to shine a light on about this issue in particular?
Well, I'll draw the obvious connection that I hope people see, which is that pro-gun politicians are also politicians who suppress votes. I hope everybody has seen that connection. That takes their claims about being the constitutionalists and the originalists right out of the water. You can't possibly be suppressing votes and telling me you're on the side of the Constitution or where our founders were coming from, because that's just BS. That's one thing that I hope people see quickly. Voter suppression, there's going to be future historians trying to deal with this question. And it's a two-sided question. I believe the answer probably will ultimately be it's had a huge effect. But the greatest story of 2018 was record voting in the midterms, right? Even though there was a national voter suppression effort. So it's a complex issue. It's a nuanced thing. As far as where I come from, I don't like throwing around the word evil, but the most quote-unquote evil thing you can do in America to me, beyond killing people, is purposely denying them the vote.
Yeah.
Which denies them control over their future and the future of everyone they love. And there's a pride about it now. There's this new video from that woman who's running for the legislature in Mississippi, talking to white high school students or college students and joking about closing down schools where students who vote Democratic vote, making it more difficult for them. And she's chuckling about it. It's wonderful. To me, it's ghastly, how far we've sank that you can be proud of being non-democratic, proud of being fascist. It's a scary place to be. But I think, like I noted with the elections, I think it's generated a response that my hope is will ultimately save our democracy.
I think many of us were holding our breath, the day of the election and
the
election. And there, at least for me, I've definitely felt more hopefulness than I have felt in a long time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, thank God. I'd be in a very bad place today if it had gone differently. It's stressful living right now. I think, we were talking before about what you can do to build the presence of young people in the gun violence prevention movement and kind of bringing these topics together. One of the things is teaching them self-care. Let me tell you this, and this is kind of scary to me. Every year, the gun control movement does an annual meeting face-to-face. There has never been an annual meeting yet we've had where we had and we do all these different sessions and seminars and panels. I mean, it goes on for 2 days. And we've never had even an optional session yet on self-care. In the gun violence prevention movement, where you're reading about shootings every day, where many of our people are survivors, some of whom have witnessed shootings, many of whom have lost loved ones to gun violence, and where you're all being actively harassed by people who are very well armed. And I never learned to self-care. It was never talked about in the movement, probably around the Charleston shooting, where I began to deal with a lot of vicarious trauma that had piled up over the years, what some of the folks might call sin eating, just reading all this wickedness and ugliness and violence and loss of precious lives. And it adds up. So I think one of the things, and they're off to such a fast start. I know they're young. I know they're teenagers and they have all the energy in the world, but they're also off to a really fast and emotional start. And I hope someone, and I do see them tweet about self-care and talk about it. I hope it's being reinforced by the adults around them. And I hope they really take it seriously, whether they stay in the movement for 5 years, 10 years, or 25. I'll be honest on this topic. I have done damage to myself by not self-caring properly and trying to be a hero and think I could, like I talked about earlier, you keep taking those punches and moving forward. But after a while, you damage yourself so much that you begin to turn on the people you love the most around you. And you don't want to get there. You don't want to hurt yourself. You don't want to hurt others around you, good or bad. So that to me is a huge key and something that we need to be really cognizant about.
Well, you've naturally led us to this next guidepost. I invested in yourself.
Yeah.
And so I have so many questions, but one is, what have you learned? I really appreciate you naming vicarious trauma as a real thing.
Oh, yeah.
And, you've said that you've done damage, but it also seems like you're at a different place of awareness now. So what have you learned? What are some of the tools and strategies to care for yourself, to sustain yourself in this really challenging work?
Well, I'm not a psychological professional, but I mean, you have to find a way when you do gun violence prevention work to turn it off. You've just got to find a way to turn it off and stop thinking about it. Stop reading articles. Stop watching TV coverage of shootings. You've got to have a place where you can get away from it and really stay away from it, no matter how much you care. And understand that by taking that time off, you're actually helping get to your goal of saving lives. By caring for yourself, literally, you're helping getting the goal, whatever it is, tougher gun laws, more resources for urban communities, whatever your end goal is, you're going to get there quicker by being a better advocate, a healthier advocate. On a more fundamental level, get your heart racing and get some really good exercise. I play in an ice hockey league. The best thing I ever did for my gun control work was joining an ice hockey and getting out there and behaving a little bit badly. Not too badly, but a little bit badly. That helps keep me safe. I need that. I need to get out there and get my heart racing and barely able to breathe and slamming into people. I mean, that helps. And that's going to be something different for everyone. Everybody, when I was young, it used to be jamming with my buddies upstairs and driving my mom crazy. That's how we would vent. So everybody has their thing. I don't know what it is for any given person, but find that thing that allows you to kind of just get all that thinking and angst out of you and all this blackness you've read about and just release it. Whatever that is, do it. Because if you don't, you are going to damage yourself and you're eventually going to start hurting people around you.
Right. And you won't be able to sustain yourself in the effort. And
right.
If we look at investment outside of ourselves, where do you feel is the place where we should be investing the most, whether it's in dollars or our time and effort for this cause?
I don't know. That's a very tough question right now. I think election work is going to continue to be the most critical thing of all. I think, we just put a lot of gun violence prevention champions in the House. There's nothing we're going to do on policy in the next 6 months that's going to come anywhere near in importance to that. I mean, just changing the mentality of Capitol Hill is critical, and getting people in there, like I said, with the post-Parkland kids that just reject this old philosophy of weakness. And the Democrats are going to say this if we try to do that, like getting away from that mentality, just leading on this, being confident that we're doing right and leading boldly with your chin up and asking for what is needed to save lives, not what you think you're going to get 10 Republican co-sponsors on. The Republicans are a very radical party right now. And the more important thing, I think, is just putting together an agenda right now. It'll start in the House. Maybe it'll continue in the Senate in the future, but putting together some type of agenda that is kind of a post-NRA agenda. The NRA is declining right now in popularity. They're being investigated by the FBI for all their treasonous relationships with Russians. If not for Justice Kavanaugh now, I mean, we could see the end of them now. So it's a time, I think, to really build our capacity with people that are confident advocates, to demand more of our traditional advocates who have in the past started out asking for a half a loaf of bread and ended up getting nothing. We need to change those habits. And I think, to me, it's really about confidence and attitude. That's the type of leadership we need to see in this issue. And educated leaders too, people who understand the issue, who think it's important enough to take the time to really understand it, who are able to put together good policy. But that, to me, I think that's the biggest thing, teaching that mindset.
Well, the last guidepost, C, stands for connected. And this is about realizing that we're not alone in the journey, that we need to work together, building relationships with our partners and colleagues. And so in the context of this conversation, I have a lot of curiosity. I know Moms Rising is doing powerful work, and obviously Moms Demand Action, the Parkland young people, the work you're doing. I have curiosity about the degree to which all of you are working together. And if you have any ideas about, how to build stronger connections in this work among people and organizations.
Yeah. The gun violence prevention movement now is interesting. You could say, and it's certainly true, that we're very connected. We've been doing a weekly call with a consistently expanding roster of gun violence prevention groups for years now. We've been doing an annual face-to-face meeting for years. The coalition of groups has certainly grown more diverse over time in a way that's great, very healthy for the movement. Once you get to the communication part, though, and connection, it's a little bit tougher. I would argue, and I'm not sure it's necessarily unhealthy, there is disharmony in the gun violence prevention movement simply because you have so many people with new perspectives in the movement. Like I discussed previously, for many years, the gun control movement was a very white movement, very led by men. And the sole focus was gun control policy, regulating firearms. There's a new generation of activists now that view the issue very differently, whether they're specifically trying to prevent gun suicides or they're coming from the Black Lives Matter or other intersectional spaces and looking at urban violence and policies other than firearms regulation that could save some of these lives. And some of these programs are very successful as well. There's a lot of new perspectives. There's a lot of challenging of what were considered, conventional wisdom things within the movement that are now being totally reevaluated, sometimes openly questioned. At times the hairs on our back bristle, but I think the most important thing is just to accept, like we've talked about, it's an ongoing process. I think the single most important thing when you're trying to connect with people is to accept that their heart is in it too. And you might not like the things they say particularly, or some of the things they do, or, their strategy might not be yours. But a baseline of trust always has to begin with, I think his or her heart in this right place, even if what he or she said isn't gelling with me right now. And then just accepting that it's a complicated country right now. It really is. It's very stressful to live here right now. There's existential fear among vulnerable populations in this country that needs to be acknowledged. I know I feel a tremendous amount of fear as a white man. I can't imagine how women or people of color feel right now. So being gentle with each other is really important. And I will tell you too, I have made a lot of mistakes in the gun violence prevention movement over the years, at times hurting people I really love because I was suffering or really stressed out or traumatized. And I've had to apologize many times, earnestly, but, in very tough situations. And I think it's really important to forgive each other and to be gentle with each other. It's a rough time. There's no playbook for how to get through this period in American history because nothing even close to this has ever happened. So we're all kind of feeling our way. Let's just, if we can, assume the best from one another and just make a commitment to keep listening. Even if it doesn't make sense this week, the next week, the week after, just make a commitment to keep listening, keep your mind open. Because if you do, eventually you're going to hear something that helps you connect and get closer.
I'm really appreciating, in this time that I've gotten to know you in this conversation, your openness. We were talking about, growth mindset. And I asked you some questions specifically about the degree to which the gun control movement has not been as aware of how white supremacy itself might be influencing the policies or where you're putting your focus or who you've invited in and whose voices are part of the advocacy. And you told me that this is something you're very much like in the midst of learning for yourself. And you mentioned a book you're about to read. So before we close with the challenge and acknowledgements, say a little bit about that. Because I think it's so powerful for a white male to name that this is something you are learning about. And also the book that you showed me that was on your desk.
Yeah, well, I have heard people who work in the gun control movement or have worked in the gun control space for some time described as white supremacists in the past. In the recent past, I've seen them compared to Nazis and other things. These have been tough things for me. I'm used to seeing the people that I work with in the gun violence prevention movement in the most admirable of terms. People who make little money, who genuinely believe in the work and really want to save lives, many of them victims and survivors. To even hear a word like white supremacy associated with the gun violence prevention movement to me is very difficult. It's very difficult. It also might not be the best choice of words, I would argue, but fundamentally, in a structural sense, it's certainly true. There's no getting beyond that. If you look at the history of the gun control movement, the facts are that the people who have led the movement at the highest levels in the national organizations have always been white men. The people who have actually done the work for us on the ground have always been predominantly women. And the politicians that have always been our surefire bets for support have predominantly been over the years African-American in many urban communities. And yet women and people of color were not really integrated into the gun violence prevention movement in any meaningful way until recent years. And I think certainly we still have a ways to go, particularly at the level of top leadership. So it's an ongoing process, but sometimes, like I was saying a minute ago, it's important to be forgiving. And for me, it was just a matter of getting past the words and trying to understand the idea. Even if you replace it with different words, there's an important thought there. And the thought there is that whether it's been conscious or unconscious, there has been some type of systemic structure in place within the gun violence prevention movement that elevates white men and really whites in general. So unpacking that can be difficult. Was it because we weren't actively reaching out to communities of color? I think that's true. Was it because there was no conscious intent to promote women and people of color? That's certainly true. But those are difficult things to grasp when you try to excuse yourself by saying, well, I wasn't behaving or thinking in an overtly racist way, right? These are subtle, nuanced things that we take for granted. We've been living with since the day we were born. So unpacking them and really understanding that and how traumatizing it can be to grow up in such a society for a woman or a person of color, it's important to at least think of that and to acknowledge that, if your feelings get hurt a little bit on the way, that's nothing compared to what a woman deals with on a day-to-day basis in this country, let's say defending against sexual assault, or what a person of color deals with every interaction they have on a given day. And the book I was talking about was the book by Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. So now I am one of the new readers, and I'm going to go into it with an open mind. But, I'll be honest, some of these have been tough lessons to swallow for me. And it's kind of jarred me because I do consider myself to be a very open-minded person. But, I was born in 1970 and I'm learning a lot. And there's so many good people doing this work to save lives. I mean, I just think at the end of the day, we have to think about what fundamentally connects us more than anything divides us. And that's just the intent to do good. And I really do believe that most people in the gun violence prevention movement, white or black, really want to live in a truly equal America. And I think we can't lose sight of that either.
Well, I cannot tell you, at least for me, how meaningful it is to hear from you, a white man with certain privileges who has been in this work for this many years, to hear you talk about that it is uncomfortable, that it is challenging, that there are no easy answers, but to hear you admit that you are beginning to see more of these structural issues and learning, and that you are, that book is on your reading list. I feel like in many ways we are kindred spirits on that path of our own growth and learning in this issue. And I have some resources that I'll link in the show notes here and also send to you of conversations I had in the first season of the Women Podcasters in Solidarity Initiative, which were a lot about how do we be in the discomfort of this? And so with Kate Schatz, who's a really powerful author and activist.
Yeah.
We talk about white fragility and a lot of these issues that you just raised. So
it's difficult to get past the stage of anger. I think on all sides, we're trying to do something really meaningful in this society right now, really meaningful. I mean, seismic important change, and we're going to have to break a few eggs before the omelet's cooked.
Well, we are at the point of our conversation now where you get to give me a challenge.
Oh, great. Is it for your viewers too, or your listeners?
Yeah. Well, this is how it works. The challenge is for me, and I really commit. I always say I haven't necessarily done every challenge to the fullest. I've released 53 episodes, and some of them I notice I come back to, but I really do hold these with great importance and take them seriously. So for sure, you will have my focus and attention on this challenge. And then I invite anybody listening who's willing to say yes to come along with the challenge as well. So I hope I will not be alone in this. Here, you said you had something very clear that you were excited to share.
Yeah, and this gets back to what we just talked about with what's the most important thing to be investing in right now. So the plan right now, what we've heard from presumptive Speaker-elect Nancy Pelosi is that the plan right now is to go forward pretty soon after January when they get sworn in and Democrats take control of the House, to move forward with a bill that would expand instant background checks. So basically, probably everybody listening has heard the term universal background checks. This is what that means. If you're a store selling guns, you'd have to get a license from the federal government to sell, and you have to conduct background checks on buyers. But most states allow private individuals in their states who theoretically aren't engaged in the business of selling firearms, although many might be. They allow them to sell guns without conducting background checks. So universal background checks simply means that it would be a policy where moving forward, every gun transfer in America, whether by a store or a private individual, would have to involve a background check. And maybe you'd exempt immediate family transfers, but that's about it. The policy that Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats apparently want to lead with after we just destroyed the NRA in the 2018 midterm elections, I mean, swept them, just did a great job with people campaigning on gun control. The policy they want to lead with is expanding certain background checks, so not covering all private transfers with background checks, but just ones that are commercially advertised at gun shows, over the internet, through a classified ad in a newspaper, etc. It's not a bad policy unto itself. I do think it would save some lives. The reason, though, why I see it as weak is that it fails to acknowledge that violent people pass instant checks in this country constantly. So one of the things probably everybody's heard is that a lot of mass shooters legally buy their guns despite having lengthy histories of violence. The reason for that is because the only element of screening on gun buyers in this country is this 2-minute instant check that involves no human element whatsoever. All it involves is a gun dealer calling up the FBI and pinging them to check their National Instant Criminal Background Check System database, which searches certain criminal and mental health records. And then all the gun dealer is seeing in return is approve, deny, or delay the sale. That's it. That's the extent of screening we do on gun buyers in this country. And what the Democrats are essentially proposing to do is expand those checks, which violent people are able to pass time and time again. Now, that doesn't mean that every violent person passes an instant check. If you're a convicted felon, it'll likely get you. But once you get into the area of people who might be dangerously mentally ill or domestic abusers or dealing with issues of substance abuse or alcohol abuse, it gets a lot looser there, and you get a lot of dangerous people who pass those checks. I would argue that it's time for us to get beyond this instant check system. The system was actually designed by the NRA at the time of the Brady Bill to kill the Brady Bill, which originally had a waiting period associated with it, and where there were actual background investigations on gun buyers at that time by local law enforcement, which is better, which is more thorough. They know the people in their community. I think we need to get out of a mind frame of seeing the instant check as the only level of screening we can do in gun buyers in this country. We should have national licensing and registration like we have for cars. One of the things that's been included in the bill that Pelosi wants to move forward with is language from the NRA that would bar federal registration of firearms and set us back in that area. So I would suggest that after this historic midterm election where so many gun control champions have prospered, that Pelosi and the House Democrats offering a bill that expands deeply flawed checks that violent people pass daily is not enough. It's not confident enough a lead. It's not bold enough a lead. It's not going to save as many lives as we need to save. It's not going to stop mass shootings. It's not going to stop day-to-day homicides. It won't stop suicides because it will allow violent people to get through that 2-minute check again and again and again. So my ask is reach out to Nancy Pelosi and ask for her to do something more meaningful, whether it's an assault weapons ban, whether you want to see domestic abusers disarmed in a meaningful way. Let's ask for more. An expanded background check bill as a starting point when the Democrats are going to have this strong a majority in the House is not enough, and it's going to signal weakness to the Republicans in the House, and it's going to, I think, significantly hamper our abilities to put together an agenda that will really disarm violent people in this country. We need to get serious about that. Even if universal background checks is not going to disarm violent people in this country, the sooner Democrats and the rest of us accept that, the sooner we can move on to a post-instant check system where those computer checks are just one element of a larger screening process that will catch these people. And I'm sorry for going on, but that's my challenge.
No, it's important. And this episode is clearly going to be longer than most of mine are. And my feeling about it is this issue requires it. It requires us to give this the time to understand. And I appreciate you explaining these things, which I now understand in a deeper way. I have a bit of a challenge for you, I think.
Okay.
I am wondering if you can take this passion and this clarity to your weekly call so that you and the other organizations can work together on an advocacy stance that then I can follow and hopefully my listeners and others can follow.
Yeah, well, the good news is that our face-to-face meeting is coming up next month. So not only the weekly calls, but soon we'll be meeting face-to-face and we're going to be going through some of these important issues. Yeah, I'd be happy to keep you in touch with progress if you're interested.
And then if you can connect with me about links, I don't know if through, One Pulse America, you're going to have a call to action there, but whatever easy way.
I have an action alert for basically the challenge I gave you. So I'll send you that and then just a couple of general links.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, we're now at the end of our conversation, and this is a time for acknowledgments, for me to share what I'm taking from this conversation and what I really appreciate about it, and then for you to do the same. So I want to start. There's so much, and I know I'm going to go back and listen to this again and take even more from it each time I listen. But one, I am grounded again in my original desire to create this initiative and to begin these, what feel like courageous conversations about race and other issues that are complex and that do challenge me. I'm regrounded in a growth mindset about moving past white fragility and recognizing that this is a process and being patient. So I really appreciate you reflecting that back to me. The next thing I'm thinking about are like really concrete places where this whole movement can focus and grow about, creating more space and passing the microphone and platform to more young people, about our focus on self-care for those who are doing this work. And then specifically about bold leadership among our elected officials, voting more of them in, ensuring that people have the right to vote them in, and then holding them accountable to action that will really matter. And then the last thing, I think I'm really touched and inspired by the example in you of a white male leader who you're in touch with your emotions and you are doing meaningful work and you are putting yourself on the line literally for the rights of young people and expanding your own awareness about how to expand rights and voice for people of color. And, as I'm raising two white boys, your example means a lot to me. And I will be sharing stories about what you're doing with them. So
Great.
Thank you for all of those.
Tell them to talk comics with me.
I will hook you up with my son Ryan, and he would be excited to do that. And I'd like to give him a chance to talk with you about your work. And
cool.
That would be really powerful.
Well, I think my main acknowledgement is just that, this work is tough. It's emotionally hard. Everybody wants to be liked and accepted, and everybody wants to be the good guy. And I think there's going to be a lot of times as we negotiate these types of issues where people feel like a bad guy. But I think one of the things I've appreciated about this discussion is I really need this. I need to be in places where I can talk about this, however imperfect I am at this stage, because I can't get through it without talking about it and without understanding it. So this was timely for me.
I'm so glad to hear that. And I hope I can continue to be a sounding board and a space for you. I want to sustain you and people like you who are in leadership and sacrificing so much.
Awesome.
So I'm glad that this was a support to you. And I know this will be the beginning of more connection. Thank you, lad.
All right. Great talking to you, Julie.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about the Mother's Quest community, head over to mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review, and help us spread the word. I want to end with some words to help light the way on your quest. Seize the day. Love your people. Honor your gifts. Until next time.